Two top Nigerian officials are suspended after bundles of cash are discovered in a Lagos flat. It added up to more than $40 million that was meant to help in the battle against Boko Haram. So can President Buhari deliver on his promise to clean up corruption in Nigeria? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine. Nigeria is one of the largest oil producers in the world. It's also one of the most corrupt. So most of its population of more than 160 million see little of that wealth, and many are even on the verge of starvation. Unlike those at the top, many of whom are accused of stealing billions of dollars with impunity. Money that was meant to help tackle the threat from the armed group Boko Haram. Now, these pictures show large bundles of cash, $43 million in all, at an expensive apartment in Lagos. The National Spy Agency claimed the money belonged to them. But on Wednesday, President Muhammadu Buhari suspended the head of the agency. He also acted against another senior civil servant who's accused of taking money meant to help feed the hungry in Borno State and giving it to companies in which he had a personal interest instead. The president's ordered an urgent investigation into both cases, and he says they're linked. Now, former British Prime Minister David Cameron, you may remember, was caught on camera last year describing Nigeria as fantastically corrupt. Corruption is difficult to measure because of its nature, but Transparency International ranks Nigeria as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. The Council on Foreign Relations says official graft rose under the previous president, Goodluck Jonathan, especially in the security, petroleum and power sectors. And his national security advisor is currently on trial, charged with diverting more than $2 billion meant to buy weapons to fight Boko Haram. But it's been a major problem for decades. By some estimates, close to $400 billion was stolen from government coffers between 1960 and 1999. Well, President Buhari says he's the man to fix the problem. He came to power in 2015, promising to stop state funds going into the pockets of corrupt politicians and public officials. And he's a former army general who took charge first in a military coup back in the 1980s. And this time round, Nigerians felt he was just what the country needed to stop money disappearing and to end the fight against Boko Haram in the north. But critics have accused him of a political witch hunt because many of those arrested so far are members of the opposition or of the previous administration. And he's already spent 7 weeks away from office on sick leave in the UK. There's not been too much information about what exactly is wrong with him. And that, of course, is raising questions as to his stamina for the job. All right, time to introduce our guests now. In London, we have Anthony Goldman, CEO of the political risk consultancy ProMedia. In Abuja, we have Saludeen Hashim, Senior Programme Officer at the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Centre. That's an NGO that works closely with Transparency International. Can I start with you then, Saludeen? So the revelations that we've just started the programme with, these bundles of cash being found in a flat in Ikoyi in Lagos, it means, doesn't it, that President Buhari's campaign against corruption isn't working?
I think the effort by the president is indeed a welcome development, and it is particularly making serious attempt to rid the system of certain traditional corrupt practices that is fighting against the system for so long since the return to democratic rule in 1999. Well, it needs to be said that corruption is not really a recent phenomenon in the history of this country. The point of worry is that corruption in the last 16, 17 years has assumed a dimension that threatens the authority and powers of the states, and a dimension that threatens the total coexistence of the country, country as it were. So we operate a corrupt economy that is arguably bigger, better structured, and even more sophisticated in its operation than the national economy.
Yeah, okay. Okay, Saladin, I'll stop you there because you're making some very valid points. I want to go now to Anthony in London. And Anthony, the problem is that Nigeria, for many around the world, is almost synonymous with corruption. It's on an industrial scale, isn't it?
I think that there's a systemic issue in Nigeria. I think that the idea that it's a question of finding the bad apples when actually it's the barrel that is the problem, I think is the real challenge. It's not simply a question of going after the people who've maybe tucked away, money here or there, or in this case, quite extraordinary sums of money. It's a question of creating a different perception of public administration in Nigeria, finding a way of getting people into responsible positions who are able to exercise responsibility without being obliged to certain people in the system, that it's the system itself that is broken, rather than trying to identify the odd person here or there and bring them to book through an extraordinarily slow process, which, if you're going to follow the rule of law and justice where that's already compromised, is an issue.
So you're suggesting then that the presidential campaign and those that have gone before, because this is not the first anti-corruption campaign in Nigeria, you're suggesting that they're going about it the wrong way. They're starting at the top and maybe they need to start at the bottom.
No, I think that you need to tackle it at both ends. I think the culture of impunity has grown up over the last 20, 30 years in Nigeria that suggests that those who've got a lot of money somehow don't have to play by the same rules as everybody else. But I think as part of that, as part of tackling that and putting people on notice that actually they are obliged to live in Nigeria under the rule of law, it's also a question of creating a system of administration that is less vulnerable to some of these corrosive forces. I mean, I was speaking with a retired public service officer early today. He said that when he joined the Foreign Service 30 years ago, he was on a salary of 500 naira that worked out then at about $700. He retired on 200,000 a month. That's also about $700. So all of his career, and he's back where he started. So this is asking an awful lot of people's integrity and a sense of responsibility on individual citizens. Nigeria, I think, needs to recognise that actually, although it appears a rich country, it's actually masquerading as its wealth, when in fact most people are very poor, and that the challenges of trying to marry up the available resources with a country of nearly 200 million people and an effective system of government for that is a real issue.
Absolutely. Saladin, I'm reading an article that you co-authored for the Al Jazeera website, in which you make a direct link between the levels of corruption in your country and the Chibok girls, for instance, and the insurgency being waged by Boko Haram, and of course the ensuing famine and dire conditions that are being experienced by so many millions of people in the northeast of the country.
Basically, if you read that article properly, you would understand why we have actually established a nexus between corruption and insecurity. And of course, we have also made it very clear that corruption has, over the years, fueled violent extremism. And of course, the Dasuki Gate is a clear testimony to that fact. You saw how people have sat down, a group of elites, shared money meant to purchase platforms to fight insurgency. We have seen where border controls have compromised a lot of issues that concern security. We have seen where security institutions have compromised a lot just to ensure that insecurity in itself has thrived. So there are quite a lot of corrupt practices within the system, and that is why we are a little bit concerned with the current trend of fighting corruption. It is rather an issue that is seen as a mere enforcement rather than looking for a deep-rooted change that will bring about reform in the fight against corruption. It is endemic. The systems and the structure in itself is faulty, and there's a need for a different approach and a total strategy that is completely different from what we have seen. So government must be more serious and more committed to this new effort, rather than just media prosecution that has actually rented the space. in the last few years.
And Anthony, as Saladin alluded to, corruption has been around for a long time, pre-independence, colonial times, and then, of course, post-independence as well. I mean, the 1966 first military coup came about as a result, in part, didn't it, to the ostentatious display of corruption by many leading politicians. I'm just wondering, does President Buhari, who most people believe has very good intentions, does he stand a chance against this great mountain that he's now confronting?
I think he does. I mean, I think he was the first leader in Nigeria to be elected with a genuine popular mandate in a free vote. And I think that one of the things that appealed to people was that this is a chap who said that this simply doesn't work, that this system that benefits a tiny number of people in the elite at the expense of the needs of the many is unsustainable. It's unsustainable even for those people at the top end. So I don't underestimate the level of resistance from within those people who've benefited. But I think that there is a balance between the theatre, if you like, of these kind of major arrests and trying to show people that something is being done, with the maybe more nuts and bolts work, if you like, of trying to reconfigure and re-engineer the system. I mean, when you're in Abuja and talking to some of the people in and around the policy-making establishment, all of the talk is about transition. It's about trying to recalibrate an economy away from this kind of casino culture, that if you get a contract, you build a house, you don't bother to reinvest anything. All of the billionaires that were created since the end of military rule under Obasanjo, the private jets, that were there when President Jonathan was in power, very little of the wealth that was generated was created, was ploughed back into the economy. I think that there was a difference between accumulating capital and generating real wealth. And I think that while the last year has been very tough for most Nigerians, particularly living in cities, because of the collapse of the oil economy, in the rural areas, in areas where you're dealing with producers rather than consumers, actually there has been a benefit. And I think that when you see the structure of the economy change in Nigeria, that's likely to do far more in terms of creating that sense of opportunity and a more level playing field that can begin really to tackle the root causes of corruption rather than the symptoms of it.
Right, I'm pleased to introduce now Garba Shehu, who is a spokesman for President Buhari. He's joining us from Abuja as well. Thank you very much for joining the conversation. I'm imagining that President Buhari must be particularly incensed by these latest cases of corruption that have been uncovered. One of them involved taking money that was destined for the presidential initiative in the northeast. This was money to help the famine victims and those suffering the consequences of Boko Haram in Borno State. It was that money that was pilfered. So the president must be particularly upset.
Certainly, the revelations have shocked beyond the boundaries of Nigeria. I think they have generated ripples all across many places in the world. We have inherited a culture in which people in privileged positions of authority would just sit down around the table as if they would have dinner, and they would just share between themselves resources that belong to the public. Now, the president had instituted this war against corruption since coming into office. In fact, it is one of the major reasons why he was elected by Nigerians into office. So therefore, yes, incidents like this, then when they rear their heads under the present dispensation, it becomes worrisome.
Indeed, and as you say, one of the main reasons for his victory in 2015 was this vow to root out corruption. He doesn't seem to have had very much success, though, does he? There have been many quite high-profile people taken in for questioning. Resources have been recovered, but there's been no one charged and found guilty of corruption.
No, on the contrary, a few weeks ago we had a former governor, for the first time in the history of the anti-corruption war in the country, a former state governor was jailed. The cases have to go through the judicial process. The Constitution of Nigeria very much rigidly divides and separates power between the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. Much as the president is in a hurry, he cannot rush cases through the judicial system. But the judiciary in our country is also undergoing several reforms. And as we speak now, actually there's a process in the parliament to create special courts to try only corruption cases so that these things are speeded up.
And coming back to you, Anthony, it takes two to tango, doesn't it? So we know about the corruption that is endemic in Nigeria, but quite often they are facilitated and, in fact, encouraged by the big companies, many of whom are where you are in London. What's happened to the notion of corporate responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is an element of burden sharing here. I mean, the dirty clothes may come from Nigeria, but Britain is the laundry, and I think that there is a lack of will. I mean, it's a challenge even in the UK. The former Minister of Petroleum Resources in Nigeria has been under investigation in London for 18 months, and it's been difficult for the Crown Prosecution Service here to find enough evidence to charge her, but is still reluctant altogether to let her go. So if the wheels of justice grind slowly here, it's a real challenge, I think, in Nigeria. I think that the problem, I think, is that there is still that mentality in the corporate sector here and it doesn't just deal with Nigeria, and a lot of other resource-rich countries of trying to take shortcuts, what you need to do to get to where you want to go. You know, there's an issue at the moment over how Shell and the Italian oil company Eni were able to secure a very good oil block in Nigeria, as if somehow this was exceptional, when I think everybody in the industry knows that that every other major oil company, the American oil companies, were also dealing with generals, retired dressmakers, taxi drivers, stable boys, other people who managed to get oil blocks, not really on the strength of what they were able to bring to the industry, but more the obligations that they had to people higher up the food chain. So I think that when there is that common commitment to dealing with the issue that corruption requires two parties, that it will be, I think, a lot easier to tackle at both ends. I think that it is a question of dealing with it at source, or the wholesale and at the retail side.
And Saladin, 2 years in to President Buhari's term in office, how much faith do the people of Nigeria retain in him? He personally has always been associated with being a straight goer, with being a very strict disciplinarian, and never has he been tainted, has he, with the scandals surrounding so many other members of the political elite in Nigeria. But how much patience do the Nigerian people have with his long and quite burdensome task?
Yeah, to be very honest with you, whilst I agree with Additional on his position, I think people are beginning to lose faith in the current vanguard against corruption. He cited the case of a former governor in Adamawa State who was for the first time jailed. I agree. But of course, by some kind of judicial corruption, that same man with some letters coming from an avenue that no one can particularly attest to, was also released from prison. A convicted governor released without an appellate court upturning that decision. That in itself is an issue that we need to further interrogate. What we have seen in Mr. President, yes, he's committed to the process, yes, he's very disciplined, yes, but the very slow pace in deciding on certain issue is also an issue that is not going down very well with most Nigerians. You find the parliament particularly taking certain decisions that are ultra-biased or contrary to the president's own stance in terms of corruption. You discover the cases piled up in Code of Conduct tribunal. In most judicial processes, we have corrupt cases that are pending. Federal governments are recently losing a lot of corruption cases And that is actually an issue of
Saladin, let me
concern.
jump in. Let me take the point that you're making and let me then put it to Garba Shehu, because as you've just heard, Garba Shehu, there is an appreciation for the president himself, but there is a growing impatience with the time that it's taking. And you've got an electoral cycle to fulfill, haven't you? You've got to prepare yourself for another election in 2 years' time, and you still haven't really produced the goods.
Actually, when they voted him into office, a lot of Nigerians, including our young people, millions of whom don't have jobs, thought that the president could fix the problems in 2 days. It takes time. As I said, the problem the president majorly has to deal with is the fact that he cannot dictate to the parliament and say this is what to do. He cannot dictate to the judiciary to say the reforms that he has initiated are being carried from the executive, driven from the executive arm of the government, and we are hoping that other arms would obviously take cue from there, especially the parliament, which itself is controlled by a majority that comes from our own political party, the APC. The president is mindful of the need to get things done. We are 2 years down the line, but we have achieved so much in these past 2 years. Look at the United Nations, the security in this was awful. Boko Haram had seized territory in Nigeria. They had bombed the United Nations in Abuja. They had taken their campaign to Lagos, deep in the south by the Atlantic. All of that is now history. So we're making progress. The war against corruption is
all right.
Is achieving
all right, but
a lot.
on this specific issue of corruption, let me just go to Anthony. Anthony, we're running out of time, so can I ask you to be brief, please? If there was one suggestion that you would make to President Buhari, something that he needs to do now in order to turn this around, what would it be?
Balance the grandstanding and the theatre with the need actually to deal with the root causes of corruption. That is, to create a system of appointments and promotion in the public administration based on merit.
Okay, and the same question then to you, Saladin. If you could have the ear of the president, what would you be recommending to him so that something that could invigorate his campaign against corruption?
I think our former governance system is actually failed. And it is not about strong leaders. It's about creating strong leadership. So he needs to institutionalize preventive mechanism in the fight against corruption.
Okay, let's put these then to Garba Shehu for the final word. So there are two strands of advice then coming from our guests on the programme. What's the president likely to do in the immediate sense? He's asked for an investigation into these two particular cases. What's he going to do to transform the system in Nigeria, which is so desperately in need of it?
The president is a good listener. He will take advice wherever they are coming from. So therefore, all of these things that are being said, he's an avid listener and viewer of Al Jazeera. The important message from all of the things that happened in the last 24 hours in our country is that the war against corruption is total. There is nobody, no matter how powerful or highly placed in government, that they are beyond the reach of the war against corruption. The job will be done, and we are seeing the results already.
Problem is time, though, isn't it, Mr. Shehu? The time is not great. You've got 2 years before you have to stand for re-election. You've got to do something now, and you've got to do something big. It's something transformational that needs doing.
The Nigerians will decide the fate of the government in 2019. And the sense we have is that, I'm not saying they don't have any alternative, they do have, but given the disarray and the lack of orientation and organization in the opposition, Nigerians will stand with Mr. Buhari and the APC in 2019.
Yeah, but in terms of policy, what is the policy initiative? Because at the moment, I'm hearing good intentions, and as you've already heard, one of our guests suggesting that we need less grandstanding, less slogans and mottos, and actually more action. So something quite radical needs to happen now.
I don't know how radical you want them to be. We campaigned on 3 major issues: the security, the war against corruption, and the need to fix the economy and provide jobs in the country. Boko Haram, 100% complete, almost 100% complete. The war against corruption, as I speak to you now, government officials, many of them, when they see government money, they won't touch it. The lesson is taken down the line. The economy, good news is that we are almost there, coming out of the recession. arising from past mismanagement. From this point, then, it is to grow the economy. With the economy getting better, Niger Delta stabilizing, oil prices getting better, and more of it being sold by our country abroad, Nigeria would have more money. Without money, you can't get anything done.
At this point, I'd like to say thank you all. That was a very interesting conversation. Garba Shehu, Anthony Goldman and Saladin Hashim, thank you very much indeed. And as ever, thank you for watching the programme. You can see it again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. If you want more discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. If you want to join the conversation on Twitter, our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.